Good afternoon, and welcome to another webcast in the Civics Connection series. This program is a collaboration of the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress, the Congressional Youth Leadership Council, and the Lou Frey Institute of Politics and Government at the University of Central Florida. My name is Fred Beitler, and I'm acting as the historian of the House of Representatives, and I will be your host today. Our conversation with two former members of Congress will focus on the war power. The Constitution wisely separates the sword from the purse, giving specific powers to the executive as commander-in-chief and to the Congress with its power to finance the military and to authorize the use of force. Today's webcast will explore those broader constitutional issues in the context of two critical events: the passage of the War Powers Resolution in 1973 and the Persian Gulf Crisis of 1990-91, 20 years ago this fall. I'm very pleased to have with me two former members of Congress who will help us explore this important topic. Congressman Bill Hudnut is a Republican who served from Indiana, who served in the House when the War Powers Resolution was debated and passed. Congressman Bob Carr is a Democrat from Michigan and served in the House 20 years ago when we debated Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. With us in the studio are 20 students who are in Washington as part of the National Young Leaders Conference. They will have an opportunity to ask the former members questions in just a little bit. Before we get to their questions, however, let's give our two former members a second to introduce themselves. Congressman Hudnut?
Well, thank you. It's great to be here. Real pleasure. My name's Bill Hudnut, and I was a member of the Congress in 1973 and 4 when this issue came up first. And then I spent 16 years as mayor of Indianapolis. That's mostly the extent of my political career.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Carr?
That's a good one, too. Well, my political genesis was the anti-war movement at the University of Wisconsin, and I went to graduate school at Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan. And throughout that whole period, the war in Vietnam was going on, and a lot of us didn't think it should continue. So I got elected to Congress. I ran once and was defeated, but I got elected in 1974, began serving in 1975. And it was my resolution in March of 1975 that cut off funding for the war in Vietnam. So I've been intimately involved in these issues, and I also served on the Armed Services Committee.
Okay. Well, why don't we get to our first question? If we have a student here, why don't you introduce yourself and where you're from?
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Jasmine, and I'm from South Carolina. I have a question about the zone of Twilight. What is it, and how do decisions happen through this process?
Well, the quick answer is that the Constitution, while it specifies that the President is Commander-in-Chief and that Congress must declare war and then appropriate the funds to conduct the war, it gets a little hazy, and that's what the Twilight Zone is. How do you allocate powers one way or the other? I prefer to call it a membrane rather than a wall, like the wall of separation between church and state, only it's a membrane that moves one way or the other. And I think that's probably the quick and easy definition of it.
Okay. Thank you.
Well, that zone of twilight comes from a Supreme Court justice who was suggesting that there is significant overlapping power between the executive branch and the legislative. And there are some very key moments in American history where it's not clear as to who has the agenda on the war power.
There's a constitutional conflict given there are fact situations, let's put it, that can have different provisions of the Constitution in conflict. The President does have the power to repel any attack, to defend the nation, and doesn't need the Congress for that. But to declare war and to mobilize our military and our economic resources to fight an enemy, it requires an act of Congress. So that's why they had the War Powers Resolution, to try to reconcile some of these things with today's nasty little fact situations.
I've got to say something about that. I was intrigued when you kindly sent me the votes from way back in 1973, which I must confess I'd forgotten. But as I looked at the votes, I was amazed and pleased, if you want, put it that way, at the way in which people from the middle and the right and the left all voted pretty much together. Either they voted yay or nay, but it wasn't a straight party line vote like you get now. And when I saw myself associated with people like Ron Dellums and Bella Abzug on one hand and Phil Crane and John Rousselot at the other end of the extreme, I thought, well, maybe I'm on the right track. I'm right in between them.
Well, both of those votes, the War Powers Resolution and the authorization of the use of force in Iraq in 1991, those are conscience votes, right? That the parties doesn't say this is how we'd like you to vote. It's kind of up to you all?
Well, I can't, that was the Gulf War resolution. That was clearly a conscious vote, and it was a very high-minded debate, and people took it very seriously. And although I voted no, generally, there were 2 resolutions, but I voted no. I never took really any heat for it in my district. But I might say too that a good question, I want you to ask the questions, and I don't want to ask the questions, but maybe in answering one of your questions, Bill could comment on whether the War Powers Act would have ever passed had Nixon not been in a weakened state at that point.
Well, I think there's no question about that, but he was on the verge of impeachment and all the proceedings that had to do with Watergate. And that's an iffy question. You know, it's a hypothetical. It's hard to answer. But he was on the ropes, and I followed Jerry Ford, who was the minority leader at the time, and he recommended a vote against that proposition because he felt that it would dilute the ability of the president to deal with foreign affairs and with the conduct of the Vietnam War.
Okay. Well, good. Well, let's go to another question from our students.
My name is Caitlin McClure. I am from Murray, Kentucky. My question is, how do you resolve conflicts or disagreements between the commander-in-chief and the legislative branch dealing with the major decision of declaring war?
Well, let me take a crack at it first. As I indicated, the president has enormous power, and some of it, he's the commander, and he or she, let me say, is the commander-in-chief, and that puts the president at the head of a huge military force with a lot of discipline and huge, absolutely huge national resources. Fully 50% of our our discretionary budget goes to the military. So, I mean, the power in the presidency and on military matters is very keen, and the president also controls the intelligence apparatus. So the president can sort of spin the story, if you will, the narrative of why all of this. Now, our Constitution gives the power of the purse to the Congress. And indeed, the president is commander-in-chief only, in a sense, at the sufferance of the Congress, because the Congress has the sole authority to create and maintain a military force. If the Congress theoretically decided we didn't want to have a military a la Switzerland or something like that, it could do so. It has the power to do so. And the president can't raise an army, only the Congress can. So it, like so many things in our Constitution, it's power, countervailing powers, shared powers that are supposed to check and balance.
Now, one question that she had that was in there that I've always wanted to know, why hasn't there been a declaration of war since the 1940s? Do you have an idea?
Well, I would think
interesting.
maybe because it's kind of fuzzy, and it's not clear-cut like Pearl Harbor was. And Roosevelt went up to the Hill the next day, and asked Congress to declare war. Woodrow Wilson advised Congress to declare war when World War I broke out and America got involved. But with the push and pull and tug that goes on in a Vietnam, maybe even a Korea, certainly in Iraq and in Afghanistan and the Gulf Storm, it's a little squishy. It's not clear-cut. Mm-hmm. If you're in that sort of twilight zone that we were talking about, in a realm of grays, there are very few things of public policy that are either absolutely black or absolutely white. Most are an indeterminate gray in between.
Part of the problem is that when this correlation of forces was put together in our Constitution, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't television, there weren't these huge budgets, there wasn't a huge a military force, and we certainly didn't have the military technology we have today. And all of those things have sort of changed the landscape. And that's why in '73 some people said we really need to adjust this a bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well let's go to another question there from our students.
My name's Nicole Harris and I'm from Lafayette, Indiana. And my question is, what do you do during a time of war and leading up to it, like the communication process that occurs between the House and the Senate?
Well, some of the resolutions are called concurrent resolutions. And the Senate, at least in the instance of the War Powers resolution that was passed back in '73, they had unanimous consent in the Senate to support that. I don't know about the situation later on, but basically it's not really the Senate and the House against the President or against the executive branch of government. It's trying to work things through. So sometimes Congress is willing to have a conference where people from both sides come together to see what they can work out, and then they take it back for a vote after there's been some compromise. Politics, in a sense, is the art of compromise, and I think that's what both parties maybe have forgotten today.
Yeah, I think one of the big problems that we have today is that under the presidency of Jimmy Carter, Congress, which at the time had around, I think, 12 various committees that had jurisdiction over intelligence, under Jimmy Carter, the Congress combined it to a single intelligence committee in the House and in the Senate, and really, in a sense, walled the members of those committees off from the rest of the Congress. And so much of what drives these international disputes and the need or lack thereof to use military force is based on intelligence. And the number of people in the Congress who actually have access to that intelligence is so small today that it allows the President to dominate the situation, dominate the airways, dominate the information channels with his or her version of what the major threats are. So there's a real serious imbalance in my judgment about the ability of the Congress to effectively check and balance the President.
So it seems, in your view, that the executive has had a significant much more power beyond what the founders had intended. Mm-hmm. You think so? And that's due to technological innovations or internal things within the House and Senate?
Both really.
Okay.
But if you look way, way back in history, really the American tradition is one of limited authority for the President. I mean, way back to John Quincy Adams, he said, we can't go chasing monsters all around the world. Mm-hmm. We have to vindicate our people and our country at home. And all through that, Abe Lincoln, when he was in the Congress, said the same thing. You can't give too much power to one person. Dwight Eisenhower said the same thing in the middle 50s when he was being pushed to be more strenuous, if that's the right word, in the conduct of the Indo-Chinese War, which became Vietnam. And that's the tradition. And I think sometimes it's o'erstepped. And vaulting ambition leaps over the constitutional barrier between executive and legislative.
Well, there's a few more questions that we wanted to get in further, but let's go to our students.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Haas and I'm from New Hampshire. And my question is, what are the relevant committees in both the House and Senate involved in the decision to declare war?
Bob, you better take that.
Well, a resolution to declare war would really start with the Armed Services Committees of both the House and Senate. However, such a resolution would be so important that, and particularly because it involves putting the economy of the United States behind such a decision, you'd probably get some form of sequential referral, and ultimately the appropriations committees of both the House and Senate would have a lot to say about that because they're the ones with the checkbook. So it would be multifaceted.
But you can't have a declaration of war without everybody voting on it.
Right.
That's what you need.
Well, one of the things that question raises is the example of the Gulf War, which had a very interesting timeline, and that's one of the things that the students were working on, because 20 years ago in August, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and George Bush, as commander-in-chief, George H.W. Bush, as commander-in-chief, rushed troops into Saudi Arabia to defend Saudi Arabia, and Congress was not in session at that point. And then Congress comes back. President Bush goes before Congress in September 11th, interestingly, 1990, and explains his use of the military there. But he never invokes the War Powers Resolution. What Congress has to do then is authorize, or actually appropriate, additional funds, because it was right at the end of the fiscal year. And you were not in Congress, and you were in Congress at that point. Here you have a defensive operation that the commander-in-chief has, Congress giving additional funding for that. But then it was an election year. We know what happens in an election year, and everybody shifts over to focusing on the midterm election. And it was after the midterm election that President Bush got up in a press conference and said, we're no longer going to have defensive operations. Desert Shield has been accomplished. Now we're going to have offensive military capacity. And Congress didn't have the authority, or didn't have any say in that at all.
The horse was out of the barn, so to speak, yeah.
That was the problem with the original resolution back in '73. It said the president had 60 days to come to Congress to ask for a declaration of war. Well, that's crazy, because the horse is out of the barn, you're already pregnant with the war, and you can't stop it when you're in the middle of it. And it just didn't make any sense to have that provision in the resolution.
And one of the things you'll hear, you hear it, and you heard it recently, and you've all heard it on television, is that people will say, well, I disagree with the president and having the war, but I'll support our troops. And so that kind of equates to this sort of schizophrenic notion that you can be against the war, but you can vote for funding because, of course, you don't want Susie and Sam Soldier to be without adequate military support. A lot of that is just baloney, frankly. The fact of the matter is, I think it's an excuse for members of Congress to have it either way or both ways at the same time, because in point of fact, and we have an example in history, when you cut the funds off, suddenly it doesn't result in a situation where rifles no longer fire, bullets no longer shoot, bombs no longer fall, and the canteen just goes away so that they're starving. I mean, that just simply doesn't happen. So there's money in the pipeline. What it does mean is that the money has to be reprioritized away from aggressive, expensive operations. And no one is ever going to assert that people who are in danger can't defend themselves. But the notion that somehow or other you have to continue to fund a bad war just to show support for the soldiers is baloney.
Okay, well, let's go on to another question. We'll make sure we cover as many as we can.
Hi, I'm Carly Thurston. I'm from Washington State. And I know you guys kind of touched on this earlier, but okay, so our country has only officially declared war 5 times. How exactly does it start when Congress decides to sort of declare war or send troops over, as has happened like with the Gulf War or Iraq? Or
That's an interesting statistic. I didn't know it's just 5 times in all of United States history. Good for you. You've done your homework. Well, I think that the president has to ask for it. And in the 5 instances that you mentioned, whether it's World War II, World War I, what have you, I think the president asked for that authorization.
Oh, absolutely. I think it raises an interesting hypothetical. What happens if you have a president that doesn't see a danger, doesn't ask for material and funds to exercise a military option someplace, but the Congress, for whatever reason, sees the need to declare war, what happens then? Probably not much, because the Congress can't be commander-in-chief, can it? And even if they do declare war and do fund it and raise the army, and the president still doesn't want to do it, that's it.
You sort of have that example in the first declaration of war, though, in 1812. It was Henry Clay, as Speaker of the House, who really pushed, wanted the war with Britain, and President Madison was very reluctant to do that. And so you had there, at that point, Congress taking the lead.
Interesting.
But after this, it's been almost all the executive branch insisting on that authority. And that raises the issue of what took place in January 1991. Here you have 500,000 troops on the ground in Saudi Arabia, poised to strike. And the president doesn't ask for a declaration of war. He just asks for some authorization of force. And Congress, the brand new Congress, what could you do when you came in? Do you remember that time?
Yeah, well, I voted no. I mean, I thought that you ought to give sanctions time to work, and if you needed to have some military options, I favored at the time allowing the president certain ability to use air power, not ground troops, but air power, and telescope into the future, and that's pretty much what Bill Clinton did in Bosnia. We didn't put ground troops in there. And a lot of people, there was a debate about whether that was sufficient, whether American air power was sufficient to carry the day. It turned out it was. But I thought, you know, well before Bill Clinton, I thought that's what we ought to have done in the Gulf War situation.
It's interesting, Bob mentioned earlier that he had no repercussions to speak of in his district. And you were running for re-election, I guess, in 1992.
Yeah,
92.
Yeah.
And the same goes for me. I lost in 74, but it's basically because of Watergate, not because of the War Power Resolution vote that I cast.
Okay.
And I think it's important for us to understand that traditionally, foreign policy has been a bipartisan matter. I mean, you go back to Arthur Vandenberg supporting FDR and Truman and so forth, and he was a good Republican from Michigan.
From Michigan, right.
And yet he was very bipartisan in his approach, which you don't have today. And I lament that, and I think it's very unfortunate.
Okay, well, let's go to another question.
I'm Mitchell from North Carolina, and my question is, what powers did the president have without the approval of Congress?
Well, I think I touched on that in Article 1. The president can defend militarily the country from an attack. If you know, hypothetically, if Venezuela wanted to invade Florida, we could repel them without a. The president could take care of that, even if Congress is in session. It's not a big controversy, but
The president's the commander-in-chief.
yeah.
And you have to recognize that fact. So if you get down to President Obama, he can say, well, let's increase the troops in Afghanistan. Let's increase them to 40,000, you know, or let's decrease them to 20,000. He has that kind of authority. But he cannot declare the war, and he cannot appropriate the funds.
Are there ways that Congress can limit the spending of funds, for example, for troops, or a specific example, is there ways that Congress can limit military aid to South Vietnam, for example?
Well, that's what happened in 1975. Was the military and the president, Gerald Ford at the time, they were running out of money to prosecute the war in Vietnam, and they were asking the Congress for a supplemental appropriation. In this case, the dynamic was that the Congress could be the vetoing power, and that's what it did. It simply did not act on the supplemental. The money ran out. The authority to spend the money ran out, and the military had to wind down the effort. And within weeks, we were out of South Vietnam. The problem, though, is that in more recent history, the Iraq War was funded off budget, which is another topic of another half hour about how you deal with budgets and things. But if you take it off the budget and you don't require that kind of accountability, then it gets harder and harder for the Congress not to give the money. So it was a dynamically clever thing for President Bush to do because it further weakened the Congress's ability to cut off the funds.
But Congress still, though, had to appropriate the money, though.
That's right.
In supplemental form
Right.
or emergency
Exactly.
form. Okay.
And they did frequently.
Okay. Let's ask another question.
I am Riley from Alabama, and how did you make the decision to send troops into battle with re-election in mind?
Well, I didn't have a problem in my district because there were no military installations in my district. If I'd had Camp Lejeune in my district, it would have been a hard decision to say we're not going, kind of thing. I happen to have a district that focused on other kinds of concerns and economic concerns, and that's a good thing too. I mean, you don't want everybody to be from a area where the political thing is go to war, you know.
Was that a big issue in the 1990 campaign? Then
No.
I'll ask about that.
Not really.
Not really? Was it?
Indiana is a very conservative state, and fighting in Vietnam was no problem for Hoosiers. They all pretty much supported the president on that. And as I said earlier, that didn't affect the vote for me one way or the other in 1974 when we were entwined in Vietnam.
We only have a couple more minutes, and I wanted to see from both of you if there has been this shift in power towards the executive. How do you think Congress can bring some of that power back in the war power?
Well, I'll yield to you, sir, but I was there during what has been called the imperial presidency of Richard Nixon. And I think that kind of imperial mentality has carried on, and I think it was very evident from 2000 to 2008. And I think that Congress has to reassert itself and somehow rein it in. As Bob pointed out, limiting the amount of funds is one way to do it. And as he said, it's a red herring to say, well, we want to support the troops, so we've got to vote for the funds. But overall, I think we're back to where we started, and that is that you've got a gray area between the executive and the legislative, and somehow you've got to try to bring that together.
And I would come back also to the thing I mentioned earlier. I think it's very important for the Congress to recapture the ability to gather intelligence or to gain access to intelligence and to disseminate that in a reasonable way among more members of Congress, and so that you don't have just a small handful who get to feel that they're part of a fraternal organization that has to keep secrets from their colleagues. So,
Proceeding on the assumption that it's good intelligence.
well,
And not faulty.
that is another one.
That's another
That is
But
another
some
one.
way
That's
that-
another half hour. We could talk about that.
Well, I think we're just about out of time, and I want to thank you, and I thank our studio audience and both our former members of Congress for this fascinating conversation. A few other conflicts in American history are as revealing, I think, than the Gulf War in 1990-91 of the interaction between President and Congress. And I think this discussion is designed to help understand how the framers envisioned the war power in the federal Constitution. Certain actions during the Persian Gulf crisis were very clearly based on the President's powers as Commander-in-Chief, and others were clearly under Congress's authority. And we talked about that zone of twilight between those two, which I think is what the founders intended, of that constant negotiation back and forth as to use the use of force. Well, I hope our viewing audience has found this discussion helpful, that you'll tune in again on November 3rd, the day after the midterm election, when two former members of Congress will discuss the results of the midterm election. I also want to thank the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress, the Congressional Youth Leadership Council, and the Lou Frey Institute of Politics and Government at the University of Central Florida for making this webcast possible. Thank you and goodbye.